go to this next doctor, professor, whatever, surgeon. Ester Lupatin, she was playing CDU, Merkel, and Mrs. Merkel.
Thank you so much. I have to say that I feel really bad to give a talk after a cyber expert like you, since I'm not a cyber expert. I'm actually the director of the Center for European...
German expert.
I am a German expert,
okay,
yes.
Good.
I'm actually the director of the Center for European Studies here at the IDC Herzliya. I'm an expert on the EU institutions, German politics, and in fact, I just was telling Chaim and Maya today that I was actually invited by the German Foreign Ministry to serve as an observer in the upcoming elections in Germany. So every 4 years, the German Foreign Ministry invites 50 experts around the globe on German politics and EU before the German elections. So I think it's going to be very exciting. So I'm going to talk about the political aspect. But before that, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you and Chaim and Tel Aviv University for inviting me for a very, very exciting session, which on the way here I told you that I think it's going to be one of the issues that will preoccupy us for so many years to come, the cybersecurity, and I'm sure that there are so many simulation games that you will have to offer in order to deal with the issue. And I think today was one of actually the first simulation game on the field, and I very much enjoyed it, so thank you so much. I would like to talk to you about the German strategy and the political aspect of German cybersecurity strategy. There is no doubt that cyber warfare would accompany us for many years to come. Today, most German analysts and the German security agencies argue that most of the attacks are actually coming from state actors. It's not non-state actors, but mostly from state actors. And most of them from Russia and China, but mostly from Russia. Politically, the Germans understand that the reason why the cyber attacks aimed to spread misinformation, but basically to weaken or alternative to strengthen certain candidates. We've seen that, of course, in the recent election in France, where there were attempts to, by spreading false information, to weaken Macron, the president of France, the elected president, while at the same time strengthen other candidates like Le Pen. In Germany, the feeling, of course, today is that especially the Russians are trying to weaken Merkel. They are not trying actually to strengthen the other candidate, Martin Schulz, the SPD candidate, but more actually the more Eurosceptic parties, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, which is a new party that was did not actually pass the threshold in the last national election in Germany, 2013, but they became more powerful in the election to the European Parliament. So in 2013, they did not pass the 5% threshold. But a year later, in the election to the European Parliament, they were able actually to get 7.1%. Which was, of course, a huge increase. Of course, compared to Britain and France, who they got, Le Pen got 25%, UKIP got 27% of the votes. It was still modest achievement, but at the same time, it was very clear that this party is actually gaining more momentum and power. From the Russian point of view, this party serves their interests because from Russian point of view, the idea is they would like not only to create tensions within Germany and show to the German public that Merkel is not doing a good job, and by inviting so many refugees, Germany is actually Merkel weak in Germany, but also the attempt is to weaken the European integration. And you have to understand from the Russian point of view, the Russians are very bothered by the sanctions imposed on them. Just recently it was renewed again, and that's something which bothers them tremendously. And from their point of view, the way they would like to the biggest dream is to disintegrate the European Union and to weaken the European project. So of course they welcome, the referendum in Britain last year. They were very happy with the results of the referendum, that Britain is actually a major power leaving the EU. Of course, in the case of Germany, it's clear that Germany is not going to leave the EU. Germany is, in fact, leading the European Union, but they would like to strengthen more and more national actors like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, in order to show the flaws on Merkel's policy. It's very, very clear that there's a kind of like a very strategic thinking behind this, and that's the major, of course. That's something that the Russians would like to do more. One thing that is very interesting, because I just gave a talk 2 weeks ago about the EU-Russian relations. Interesting enough, although there are more and more cyber attacks, they're actually getting closer. It seems that the Europeans need the Russians today more than before. So if you look at the type of relations that they had 5 years ago, they used to be much more critical vis-a-vis Russia. Especially we know that 2013, 2014, annexation of the Crimea, but things have changed since then. And I think one of the things that have changed, and maybe it might affect also cyber attacks in the future, but it seems that one of the things that have changed is that there is a more and more realization today in Europe. Also, I'm going to Germany almost every month, and when I'm speaking to my German colleagues, it's very clear that they don't look at the Russians anymore as a kind of an enemy, but as a friend. But for example, from their point of view, Russians are serving their purpose, especially in the civil war in Syria. They don't want to intervene militarily. So for them, from their point of view, it's ideal to have Russia actually playing an important role. And it's very clear, and you can see also the language is changing, like in the recent Council conclusions, European Council summit. So they're still demanding that Assad will be removed, but they know, if you speak to EU officials, they will tell you, we don't actually demand anymore that Syria is going to be democracy. So there's a lot of demands that the Europeans, and especially the Germans, are willing to compromise in order to achieve stability and to prevent refugee waves to Europe. So from their perspective, Russia is actually helping to stabilize the situation and can help to prevent waves of refugees coming to Europe. So we see a kind of like a change in the European mindset vis-a-vis Russia, and especially, and I think it will likely to we're likely to see more of it in the future, that the Germany actually will get more closer to Russia than before. And we'll see the Russian more as a kind of an asset rather than liability. I also suspect that in the case of Ukraine, I said it already a few years ago, the losers, of course, are the Ukrainians here. They're not going to get the territory back, unlikely. And I don't think that under this state of affairs, especially as Russia is playing such an important role in Syria, they're not going to demand a strong demand to withdraw from Crimea. So I think in this respect, I would say it's like the train left the station, and it's a kind of a done deal, Ukraine. And I definitely see kind of like more and more tendency to get closer. One of the things that I'm doing now also, like in terms of research, we're doing a kind of a content analysis about how the German press frame the relations between Germany and Russia. And you can see a change in the framing, change in the terminology. So if in the past they used to be much more critical, we see a change. They're more and more trying to become more friendly, more accommodating to the Russians, and I believe we're going to see more of this. As I say, I'm not a cyber expert, but I would think that in the future, when the Germans and the Russians are going to get closer, it could be that it might also affect the number of attacks on Germany. A few things just about to say something about, what Germany is doing in the field of cyber attacks. So it's very clear that the German government, for example, approved recently a cyber security strategy. They want to create a mobile quick reaction force, which will seek to foster interagency coordination. They also want to build up awareness and support for business, for the business community, because, if you're a small business and you don't have a lot of money, it's very, very difficult, of course, to fight against cyber attacks. So, of course, they want to help them out. the problem is, and I think this is the thing that we talked about in the simulation game, I think the major problems today, there's no doubt there's a lot of cooperation also at the EU level. And we've been witnessing a lot of cooperation since 2013. EU actually has been decided to also to create a kind of a computer security incident response team, so in case of emergency. So since 2014, we see a lot of cooperation at the EU level. There was even a directive that's supposed to secure more of the online environment. And of course, Germany is a member of the EU. And this actually directive was approved last year. So we can see a lot of cooperation at the EU level, but you have to understand that still EU institutions are not heavily involved as, for example, in other policy areas, for example, trade policy, which the Commission, of course, has a lot of power in this field. So they're still hesitant and reluctant, but I guess in the future there will be more cooperation to cooperate on the national, between governments, between the European governments. I guess it will change in the future, but I think the problem today is from a legal point of view. Because, for example, recently the German Interior Minister said that he would like to wipe out servers that operate, let's say if you have servers that operate, I don't know, in Finland or in the US, but they're actually operated by the Russians, how do you deal with it then? What do? You don't want to get into confrontation with the Finnish government or with the US government. So there are a lot of challenges and a lot of issues that has to be tackled from a legal point of view. I guess that one thing, like going back to what you said, and you are the expert in terms of cybersecurity. I think that one thing that I hear from my German colleagues that they would like to promote very much is to have a cooperation also at the international level. So what many of my German colleagues are saying that it's not enough to have a Paris agreement and to have ICC, International Criminal Court, but it's also good to have a cooperation also in the field of cybersecurity and to think about mechanisms to penalize, those criminals. How do you deal with that? The major challenge is that we're not talking about, lonely wolves, as we said. We're talking about wolves that behind them there's a kind of a state supporting them. And that's the major problem today. How do you deal with that? So I think that there's a lot of cooperation which is still needed, but I think this is that's going to be a challenge, and I guess we're going to see more of it in the future. Thank you so much.
Any questions to Dr. Lupatin? Yes? Okay. You know him?
So I guess
It's a,
political science right now, we're really adapting to the reality of cyber and how that affects a lot of theories that try. I guess the question I have is, what axioms are assured destruction a thing? Is it possible that they just shut down an power grid, but they symbiosis, they just want to say that they can? Like what paradigms stay and which ones are avoided?
I think it's a great question, but I have bad news for you. Democratic thesis is over. It's over. It was very famous in, I just want to, for those of you who are not familiar with that, 1986, Michael Doyle, which is a very famous scholar, published actually a study about that, showed that democracies don't actually fight against each other. There are only rare cases, and he showed it in, that France and Britain had, some occasions where they actually fought against each other, but in general, they don't fight against each other. The European Union and Germany for many years actually believe in the idea of democratic peace thesis, DPT, democratic peace thesis, but actually they abandoned the idea already like 15 years ago. The fact that Hungary, Poland, Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European countries are actually members of the EU today. It's because of the DPT, the democratic pieces. It's because the belief at the time was that how do you create peace and stability in your Eastern neighborhood? You invite them to the EU, but you demand one thing in return, that they will be democratic and have like democratic institutions, have respect for minorities, respect for the rule of law. So there were 5 criteria that Poland and other European countries have actually to meet in order to be a member of the EU. So today we know that this theory is not working anymore, and that's why, and especially after the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, I think, in the beginning there was a kind of a feeling of euphoria. I can tell you that many of my German colleagues really hope that it's going to work, and they believe it's going to work out. But today, even at the EU level, if you look at the new enlargement policy, the new neighborhood policy that the EU actually recently came with, they don't actually mention the word of democracy. It's not mentioned anymore. The only thing they want to create today is stability. They don't talk about democracy anymore. Like, it's a kind of like passé. It's no longer, we shouldn't use it because it's very difficult to enforce it. We cannot actually convert people, and it's very difficult. It's not, and actually we might actually get a worst case scenario. So maybe it's better off to be where we are today, but stabilize the region, making sure that not so many refugees will come in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Heiken. Okay.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I think the biggest threat, theories aside, to democracy is the concept of behavioural sentiment manipulation online. So the voter sentiment manipulation. I think we've seen in Brexit and we've seen in the US election a lot of interference with that process. So there's one particular company who claimed to have 5,000 data points on a couple of 100 million people. So as a behavioural profiler, if I knew 5,000 data points about a person, could I manipulate them? Absolutely. Could I hold them along a Socratic line of reasoning, of relentless logic to get them nearer to my position? You know, if they're a little bit racist, do I start actually introducing into their feed and use bots to help me to actually syndicate and organize that? Do I make sure that the stories are ones whereby, you know, race was a big issue in terms of feeding into their filter bubble? So we talk about filter bubbles. If you've an interest in gardening and you're in a gardening filter bubble, or you've an interest in working out, you're in a working out filter bubble, what if you end up in a bubble of distorted thinking? And I think that we really have to question the superpowers in an era of behavioral sentiment manipulation online are the giant tech industry companies who've got a much clearer picture of what's happening than the rest of us as observers. And the other point is that if you have 5,000 data points on a person, and again, in both of the recent elections that I spoke about, one news item was taken, one statement, and then up to 50,000 variants of that statement was actually manufactured and then profiled to the recipient. So whatever that is, taking one source of news and making 50,000 variants, that's not democracy, and that's much closer to propaganda.
Thank you. That's my job today.
Yeah. I just want to add one small thing to what you've been asking before about the paradigm that has changed. And I think that, I've been teaching in the last 7-8 years course about international relation politics and international relations theory. And, the leading theory in international relations realism, the scholars of realism believe that the basic aim of the state is to ensure the survival of the state. They talk about an anarchy. We don't have international government that can actually regulate the relations between government. So that's why we can only rely on ourselves. How do we rely on ourselves? We purchase the most sophisticated weapons, the most sophisticated, technology in order to protect ourselves. And Mersheimer, one of the most, of course, glaring and important representatives of this school, actually suggests when he was asked, so when do we stop? Is there a point where we say it's enough is enough? He said, no, you never stop. You always actually try to purchase the newest technology in order to secure yourself. But today, in the simulation game, I was thinking, it's interesting because, in fact, in the case of cyber attack, we don't really even have to use one bullet. We don't really need it. It might be in the future, because eventually, you can actually feel like maybe operate, nuclear reactor from a distance. You can do so many things without using. Yeah. So that's, I think, something which is kind of like it's actually changed our perception about, like weapons and maybe, Thank you so much.
Thank you.